Thank you. Thank you, Yash, and thank you, Nikolai, for having me. I'm just clicking away this dialogue now. So I was also able to share my slides already while you were introducing me so kindly. So it's great that all of this is working. Well, a couple of things, because you mentioned the name of the lab. So I wanted to have kind of a name that reflects a little bit of what I stand for scientifically, and so and also I like puns. So what I figured out is that AIDOS is a very nice name for this, because it means artificial intelligence for discovering obscured structures or shapes, if you will, which is what I'm doing all the time, essentially. I mean, with different goals, of course. So sometimes we want to predict stuff, sometimes we just want to observe things. But it also has this neat hidden meaning, because the Greek word eidos means humility, and it's kind of, for me, the most important attribute. Might sound a little bit cheesy, but for me, it's the most important attribute when being a scientist, or when being an AI scientist, maybe, because I'm seeing that people out in the field, they're actually doing really, really hard jobs. They're saving people's lives and so on. And we have this very privileged position in that we get some of their data and we can analyze something and we can train a model on this, but we're kind of removed from the actual people that work with this data. And I think this should instill some kind of humility or even reverence into us when it comes to working with such data sets, because fundamentally AI should be in the, well, a source of good, or a force for goodness in the world. And this is what I'm trying to instill with the lab. But okay, onwards. I'm sorry. Don't want to keep this up with a philosophical discussion. I'm going to talk about a good scale is hard to find, shape analysis using topology. The title is also a little bit of a pun. You can find this out. There is a song about this, about how a good man is hard to find, but there's also a book about this, and so you can pick whatever you fancy here. So already to start with, let's get acquainted a little bit with topology. I'm not going to talk too much about networks here, because networks are a little bit subsumed in the things that I'm doing, but all the things I'm saying today apply directly to networks. It's just that I've picked two applications that I wanted to show you today that have a more biomedical flavor directly, and where I can point towards some of the improvements that we made. And so I figured that this would be good to show, but please bear in mind that there's also something else that we can do. Nikolai already said that we can have a question round afterwards, but if you don't mind, if you don't understand something, and if you don't mind being recorded while asking so, then please also feel free to interrupt me, because it's always hard gauging the audience and the reaction to that. But anyway, let's start a little bit. So first of all, this is almost my favorite slide in all the talks that I give. It's what is computational topology actually? Well, computational topology is a way to figure out why those three objects here are not the same, why they differ in certain aspects. So for instance, this cube looks a little bit weird because it might have some corners, so it's not really a smooth object. The sphere is, of course, a little bit smoother, but if one is just interested in the overall shape, you could think about a transformation that takes you from the cube to the sphere, namely you just smooth down this corner. So it's like a craftsman or craftsperson that takes a file to the cube. You can file off the corners and make it more smooth. And so in some sense, the cube and the sphere are probably not too dissimilar, but when you now take a look at the sphere and the torus here on the right-hand side, then of course you will see that, well, they somehow fundamentally differ. And the biggest thing that we humans perceive when we look at this, we say, well, one has got a hole, the other one doesn't have one, or doesn't have a visible one. Or to put it in another way, the torus has multiple ways of being put on a Christmas tree, but for the sphere we need to play a little bit around and make this happen. And so topology aims to answer this question in a fundamental way. And also, coming from my background, I'm doing algebraic topology, or I used to do algebraic topology as a mathematician. And algebra, as you know, is about counting things, or about actually calculating things. And so algebraic topology also searches for things to quantify this in a simplistic manner, in something that can be algorithmically or in a computable fashion added to an algorithm, to a computer, which is also why it's neatly related to computer science. So this is our question: why is a sphere not the same as a torus? And algebraic topology has a simple answer to this, and we're not going to go into all the details here, but just so you've heard some of these concepts here. So the simple answer of algebraic topology is to say, well, the number of holes in the data set is different, and this is why the data sets themselves or the objects themselves are different. And specifically, there's 3 types of holes that we are interested in when we're doing this in low dimensions. So those are the connected components, or the number of connected components, the number of tunnels, and the number of voids, a void being something that is enclosed by our surface. So for instance, this sphere contains a void, and also the torus, you have to think of these objects as being hollow. It also contains a void. It's a little bit like the torus. I always imagine this thing as being part of a bicycle. So this is like your bicycle tire. It has some air in it, so it's not solid. And this number of d-dimensional holes is known as the Betti number. So you can calculate it in different dimensions, and it can be used to distinguish between those spaces. So just as an example, here's a few signatures that you can see. There is a point that has only a connected component and nothing else going on for it. There's a cube which has the same signature as a sphere, pointing towards that they are maybe a little bit dissimilar. That they're a little bit similar to each other. And then there's the torus, which has a little bit of a different signature. I'm not going into the details why this is the case, but this is kind of our pole star here, this calculation of the number of holes, or in general of properties that distinguish spaces. Betti numbers can be calculated quite efficiently. We don't have to think about this too much. There's software for this, and this kind of works, but it only works if you already know a little bit what your object should look like. So what you need in formal terms is called a triangulation, or a mesh, if you will, of your data set, or a network as well. And in real world data scenarios, we are not being provided these sort of things. So we have to make do with what we have. And what we do is we have to create triangulation from the data. And to manage this, we calculate approximations to our data sets. One of these approximations is known as the Vietoris-Rips complex, and the overall term that you might encounter if you're looking at this is called simplicial complexes. So simplicial complex is just some kind of triangulation of a data set. You can think of a graph, for instance, as being a specific type of simplicial complex, but simplicial complexes can model more things than you can model in a graph. For instance, they can also model things like cliques directly, whereas in a graph you have to figure them out. You have to find them first. In a simplicial complex, they are included as first order objects in some sense. Now, this Vietoris-Rips calculation is very easy. We just need a distance measure and a distance threshold epsilon. And what we do is we increase this threshold epsilon, and we connect all the things that have a pairwise distance of epsilon or less. So essentially, the Vietoris-Rips complex consists of all the subsets that have pairwise distances less than or equal to epsilon. And we can see what happens if we increase this threshold here. So you can see that in the beginning, there's not a lot of connections. Then somehow you see more of the data, and at some point you have reached an upper limit, and everything is connected with everything else. So hence, for every epsilon, you get a specific triangulation, you get a specific simplicial complex. Now the question is, of course, how do you pick this epsilon in practice? So how do you pick the right scale? And this is where persistent homology, my favorite flagship algorithm of algebraic topology or of topological data analysis, comes in, because it is following the nice philosophy that more is more. You can just pick all the scales. You can just calculate simplicial complexes for every value of epsilon, and you just watch how the topological features of these complexes change. So whether you have a hole appearing or being closed, or whether you have connected components that get merged, and so on and so forth. And all of these features that you observe during this process, you assign them to a topological descriptor, to a persistence diagram. So let's just illustrate this for some point cloud here. So as you can see that we can increase this threshold, and we connect more and more and more. And at some point we are finished. And then we get this beautiful descriptor that tells us something about the topology. So every point in this descriptor is representing an actual topological feature. So something like a cycle or a tunnel in the data set. The neat thing is that this descriptor is always 2D, regardless of how large your data set is. So as long as you can calculate this, you always get 2D descriptor out of there. In fact, I should state that you get actually multiple of these descriptors out of there, one for every dimension in your data set, but this is par for the course. So this is just something that you that you need to deal with in practice. Now, these descriptors are not just being calculated for the sake of having something to calculate, but they also have very nice properties because, for instance, they allow you to calculate distances between them. And these distances are actually kind of funny and interesting because even though you have these topology-based descriptors on which you calculate some of these metrics, some of these similarity measures, they still have a geometrical meaning. So there's some very interesting deep theorems that tell you that, for instance, the geometrical dissimilarity between two spaces or two input objects, if you will, is actually an upper bound for the topological similarity. So that's really, really interesting to me because on the left-hand side of such an equation, you have these distances between the diagrams, like a bottleneck distance or Wasserstein distance. And on the right-hand side, you have a geometry-based measure. So this also illustrates maybe a little bit of the fascination that I feel when I'm working with these sort of techniques, because they give you a perspective both in terms of geometry and in terms of topology. So it's not very rigid as having to pick one perspective over the other, but you get information from both of them. Now, without going into the details too much, there's two distances that are interesting, the bottleneck distance and the Wasserstein distance. Both of them involve solving some kind of optimal transport problem. So you try to match the points in one diagram to each other. They're a little bit restricted in terms of what they can see or what they can capture in the diagrams. The bottleneck distance is only calculated using the maximum of these matching errors, whereas the Wasserstein distance goes over the total sum of that. I think it's best illustrated in a simple example. So if we have the same diagrams here, so the blue one and the red one, we calculate the bottleneck distance and the Wasserstein distance, then the bottleneck distance is realized by just looking at one pair of the points, so like the largest bottleneck that you have to do, whereas the Wasserstein distance uses all these pairs here and actually calculates those. You might think now, okay, what happens with the rest of the pairs? Well, they get ignored because it's an optimal transport problem that is made balanced by some computational tricks to ensure that you can calculate these distances between diagrams of different cardinalities. So also for this, we have some nice algorithms to do that. Doesn't scale maybe super nicely. I'm going on the record here to say this, but it scales nicely enough for all practical purposes. And of course, you can approximate everything and then run some kind of GPU-based schemes and so on. Now, nevertheless, people have thought about other ways to make this a little bit more affordable and to make this a little bit more integrable into machine learning pipelines, or classifiers, I should say. And one of the simplest ways, and also the most powerful, I would say, or versatile way, has been introduced by Henry Adams and colleagues in 2017 already, and it's called the persistent image. So the rough idea is, I think, best illustrated in this sequence of images. I'm not going to talk about the mathematical details too much, but basically you take such a diagram, you rotate it a little bit so that you don't have a lot of empty space that you don't care about, and then you just discretize it like doing a spatial histogram and convolve it with a kernel. So for instance, a Gaussian kernel here. And the neat thing about this is that as you increase the number of cells in your data set, you can increase kind of the resolution of this image. You can see that there's a hierarchical representation going on between those. And well, why would you do this? The answer is pretty simple. This is an image, and so it can be thrown into a neural network because regardless of how many points you have in your persistence diagram, this image is always the same size. So of course you lose information if you have a lot of points that are being thrown into a single cell in this image here, but it works out pretty neatly, and you can treat this with either convolutional neural network architectures, or even with fully connected networks, or even with older classical machine learning algorithms, or maybe I should say statistical machine learning algorithms like a support vector machine. So this is kind of neat. This kind of works, and I still like to use those for certain applications, and we're going to see one of those next, namely the analysis of the shape of fMRI data sets. So just to show you what we're talking about, I unfortunately didn't pick a very cool image or very cool movie here, but basically fMRI is a time-varying way of measuring the blood oxygen level dependent activation function in the brain. This is, of course, just the output of that. So we're not really cutting open anyone here. It's non-invasive in this sense. And the idea is that if you do these fMRIs, you can literally see what types of regions are lighting up in the brain as someone undergoes a specific task or watches a movie and so on and so forth. So you can link this to very nice things in the stimuli that a person is being shown. And our approach for tackling this is a little bit, well, unorthodox, I should say. So we consider this activation function that you measure, we consider this to be a time-varying function on a very nice manifold M, and then we calculate the topological features of this manifold M as they are measured using this function. And we obtain, through this procedure, we obtain stable topological summaries at different resolutions. Now, the cool thing about this, and this is not meant as a disrespect to other methods or anything, but just to show you the kind of niche that we are incorporating or that we are inhabiting here, is that we are really working with the raw data, or as much raw data as it can get. Of course, we can benefit from things like a brain mass. So if you tell our algorithm where the brain is actually in the volume, then we don't have to calculate things over the voxels. But in general, we don't need any auxiliary representation. So we don't turn this cool fMRI data set into some kind of network, which potentially might change the representation quality or the expressive power of the data. We don't do any of this. And we don't even require the choice of an atlas. So sometimes neuroscientists pick an atlas and they say, okay, we're interested in segmentation of the brain like this. And so we don't look at all the interactions between the voxels in the data, but we pool interactions of different brain regions. And all of these methods, they have their approach, they have their applications, they have their justification, obviously. It's just that what we liked about our method is that it has fewer modeling choices in total, and we can sort of see what we get with a very simple principled approach that just says, hey, this is a time-varying function on a manifold. Let's see what we can get from this. I should stress that this is a NeurIPS paper from 2020, but we're still working on a longer version. It has been, let's just put it like this, COVID hasn't helped putting a wrench in the works here, and organizing a research team over many different countries and continents even was not super easy, but I think we're making some progress now. And so I think this will be one of the cool things that I'll continue to work on in the future. Now, brief introduction here, maybe to the background or to the theory behind that. So previously I showed you these simplicial complexes, so everything looked a little bit triangular. Here we're actually cheating a little bit. We are working with what we call cubical complexes. Well, not only we call it that, also the rest of the community. So it's not our invention, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view. The nice thing about this is that with minor modifications to the algorithms that we already have, our persistent homology algorithms, so our algorithms that give us these nice topological descriptors, they work in this setting just as well. And so we can directly apply all our pipelines and work nicely with this. If you're interested in this, there's a great paper by Wagner and colleagues from 2012. Now, let's give you maybe an intuition of how this function might look like. So this is a 2D manifold, namely the plane, and a 1D function on this plane, namely the height function. It's actually some mountains near the Interlaken region, and the blue plate simulates a little bit of global warming and shows you what happens if you fill this up with water. And as you go up and down with this plane, you can see that different mountain ranges appear and disappear, or rather get merged together. And this is what our algorithm is also kind of capturing over all the scales of the input signal. And you can also see that this works nicely, and it is not restricted to 3D data. Potentially it could also go higher, but for now we're doing 3D plus time varying data. And here's maybe a simple data-rich pipeline of what it is that we are trying to accomplish. So we start with our fMRI data stack. We extract the volumes from that. We turn it into a cubical complex, which sounds more complicated than it is, because in some sense, the volume is already a cubical complex. We just have to make sure that we know which values we are measuring at which point. So in our case, we're saying every voxel is a vertex in this complex, and we measure the signal, the fMRI signal on every such voxel. We then get a very nice bunch of persistence diagrams out of that. Notice that there's a third dimension now, because it's a time varying signal. So essentially we have a third dimension, third axis on which we get this topology. My collaborators call those watermelon plots, and I think I would be happy if I could somehow adopt, get the community to adopt this nomenclature, because it's kind of neat. And I should stress that as a last step, maybe we are converting those diagrams also into images to work a little bit more nicely with them. But you'll see that there's two branches in the pipeline that we can follow. Before showing you what this can do actually at this point, two brief remarks on the data set. So it's a data set where people are being shown the movie Partly Cloudy, which is a very cute movie. I kind of liked watching it a lot. It's also not too long. The nice thing about this data is that we have 122 children and 33 adults. They're all watching the same movie. So this amounts to what I would say a continuous stimulation of participants. So we're not doing, there are some fMRI studies where people are resting and essentially just thinking about nothing, if there is ever a way to accomplish this. But here we have kind of a controlled stimulus. Of course, we cannot control whether they're actually engaging with the movie and thinking about it, but we can at least make sure that they all see the same things. And anyway, the nice thing also about this type of data set is that prior to basically submitting the paper, I had no clue about who was who. So I didn't know whether a participant was a child or an adult. I didn't even know which sorting was applied. So I just basically knew for two participants whether they were part of the same age group, but I didn't know the proper label of this age group. This was done to make sure that I don't do anything stupid and inadvertently maybe create a confounder or something like this. And I have to stress that sounds a little bit self-congratulatory, but I think it worked out because the method is really general. It doesn't make use of any kind of labeling information. So, which is also kind of nice if you're trying to run this for yourself, and maybe some of you will approach me about this. So this can be super nicely parallelized to a cluster, because none of these persistence diagram extractors does need to know anything about the rest of the data. You can just throw it on there and just let it do its thing. So this is kind of important to maybe contextualize the applications of the results that we had. Now, before I show you some nice results for a prediction task, there's one thing that I have to slide in there somehow. So since the persistence diagrams themselves, so these kind of watermelon-y thingies, they were still relatively tough to handle for prediction tasks. So what we did in the end is we summarized them with a simple norm. So we kind of looked at the overall values in the data set and then summarized them to a single scalar value. This is kind of a nice way of summarizing the topological descriptors, because it turns out that these norms are very stable in the sense of if you change the diagram a little bit, the norm also doesn't change too much. And moreover, for our time varying persistence diagrams, this means that we turn this complicated time series of descriptors into a very simple scalar valued signal across the data set. And with this signal, we can now do some interesting predictions. One prediction that we did, and which is also included in the paper, is the age prediction based on summary statistics. So for all the children in the data set, we try to predict their actual age, so not just their age group, but their actual age using their topological signal. And what you're seeing here in this table is a correlation coefficient. We also have a bunch of other measures in the papers on R-squared value, for instance. I want to point towards two things that worked out really nicely. So first of all, with these two norms here, we get spectacularly good results. So we get 0.77 as a correlation score for one specific type of data set, or 0.61 for another type. More about this in a second. The baseline methods don't work as well. So there's a clear distinction between what happens if you were to use correlations derived from, for instance, the time varying components of the data set, or if you even try to build kind of a graph as other methods are doing this. And likewise, our competitors' method, or rather, well, the main competing method, the SRM method, also did not perform well here. Now, one word about these three different columns before moving on. So those represent three different brain masks. So our collaborators gave us access to the normal brain mask. So this is just basically the volume, but all the voxels that are not part of the brain itself are removed. So this is just like the basic sanity check, I would say, because it gives you access to all of those things that you should be running your analysis on. Then we have an OM brain mask, which is the occipital temporal lobe. This is suspected by our collaborators to be very much relevant for the visual processing and understanding of things that are going on, which is a perfect match if you're watching a movie and want to try to understand what is going on. And XM is the XOR of those two masks. So anything that is not occipital temporal, but still in the brain. And so you can just see that literally if you zoom into a specific region, so if you look at the occipital temporal mask, which provides you an overview of the visual system of participants, then you can see higher correlations here. This, I think, is biologically not too surprising in hindsight, because we know that the visual system is developing a lot in children. And so the fact that this might provide a good indicator of how old a child is when we are giving them a visual stimulus is a good way to kind of vindicate our method, or to kind of justify that. I should state that, since this is also on the record, I'm very much aware of the fact that this task is somehow an artificial task. I would say, in the parlance of a computer scientist, I would say this is kind of a smoke test. So it is basically meant to check whether we are actually capturing anything in the data, and whether the things we are capturing are somehow consistent with known biological results. So this was not, the target was not to predict the age of people based on fMRI data sets. I think there's faster ways to accomplish this. So this was more like or maybe even like a debug test. And it worked out well. We're really happy about this. We also went further and used these persistence images now that I showed you to actually do embeddings of whole cohorts. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's really hard to interpret, and it's somehow complicated to make sense of. But what you see here is every column here is a specific age group. They are ordered from left being the youngest children to right being the adults. And every row shows you a specific mask. So the whole brain mask, the occipital temporal mask, and the XOR mask. And the idea is now that these trajectories show you the overall cohort behavior. So for instance, how is the topological complexity expressed in the youngest children? And interestingly, you can see in this occipital temporal mask, which is most predictive maybe for the age, you can find that there is some kind of similarity in the younger children when it comes to processing the movie. And then as they grow older, I should say, the processing approaches that of the adults here. The idea for this was, and this is something that we still are trying to capitalize on, or to use in more complicated settings, the idea is that, can we use these persistence images for other tasks? Could we, for instance, link them to the emotional behavior of someone, or to the maybe perception of a participant? And these results seem to point towards the fact that this can be the case. But as I said, it's ongoing work, so we still have to figure this out. But it's a very, very interesting project for me, and one that I'm really, really excited about, because of course, if you have access to these fMRI datasets, or just MRI datasets, right, you can also look into things like dementia, for instance, and you can try to figure out whether there's biomarkers for this, or whether you can predict the progression of people. And these are things that I do care about, because this is a societal epidemic of also unprecedented proportions nowadays, and I would be very happy if I could make a dent in this and help patients increase their quality of life, or maintain a certain quality of life. But that's maybe more for the overall outlook where this could go. Now, let's take a quick breath and go from this macroscopic, namely whole brain, to the microscopic. And this is a project that was recently finished. It will be shown at MICI, the medical imaging conference, and it should also be a new version, should also be on archive tomorrow. Let's see whether I botched that up. But here the idea is that our collaboration partners used confocal fluorescence microscopy to obtain images of single cells. So like literally a single cell under the microscope. This has nothing to do with scRNA-seq. I was initially, much to my chagrin, I was initially confused about this because I'm a simple person, and when I hear single cell, I think scRNA-seq. Anyway, given these images, they now want to know the 3D shape of a cell. Why would you want to do this? Well, this is what doctors call morphological analysis, and understanding these morphological characteristics of a data set is critical for certain pathologies. So to quote from an article on red blood cell morphology, when used properly, RBC morphology can be a key tool for laboratory hematology professionals to recommend appropriate clinical and laboratory follow-up and to select the best tests for definitive diagnosis. So basically, figuring out early on if there's something misshapen going on in your red blood cells is a very useful way in having good diagnostic markers. And maybe you remember this absolutely atrocious company called Theranos, which wanted to do blood analysis. So they wanted to screen your blood drops for certain diseases and so on, and it turned out to be a massive sham. I don't want to rant on about this, but this technology actually has a kind of promise here, maybe on a smaller scale and with a much more specific or narrow focus as to which type of pathologies can be detected. But nevertheless, anything helps, right? So if you had the option to quickly just drawing a little bit of blood, which is readily available for all people most of the time, it's one of the fluids that you can get quite easily in a clinical setting. If you had a way to predict certain things about a patient there, then I think we should be using that. And this is one first step in that direction. So we're not even close to solving this, but at least we're going in the right direction, I think. And namely, what we have already so far, and this is largely due to one of my lovely collaborators from Helmholtz Munich. So Dominic developed Shaper, which is a method for predicting these these 3D shapes, these output images from 2D data. The way that this is done, where I'm going to see a graphic on the next slide, is a very nice deep learning autoencoder architecture. What it amounts to, mathematically speaking, is a complicated inverse problem because you want to go from 2D to 3D. So this is super ill-defined because, well, technically, it's like looking at a shadow and then trying to predict the shape. Of course, you can check whether the shape matches the shadow, but there's a bunch of other things that can produce similar shadows. So it's not easy to accomplish. Essentially, not going into the details here, it uses a very nice convolutional neural network architecture and then some fully connected layers here. What it does, like essentially, is it learns a likelihood function mapping from the volume to the to a probability distribution, I should say, or rather to the real values. So essentially, it shows you how likely is a given voxel to be part of the actual shape of the volume. And so this lives on a voxel grid, and you can see whether it's part of the true volume or not, and you can kind of regularize and train your model accordingly. So the current loss function for training this model uses a geometry-based loss term, which is an average of a so-called dice loss and a binary cross entropy loss. The actual definitions are not super important here, but the intuition behind this is maybe a good takeaway, is you compare the geometry of the resulting volumes on a per voxel basis, and then you check whether the reconstructed volume is well aligned with the ground truth volume. And this worked occasionally, I should say, but it turns out that we can make it work much better by regularizing the model, by adding an additional inductive bias to it in the form of topology. And specifically, we developed this nice additional topological loss term, LT here, which consists of two interesting loss components that are sort of working independently with different goals. the first component is, and you've already seen this before, is a Wasserstein distance between the diagrams. So essentially this says, taking the ground truth likelihood function of the data and the predicted likelihood function f prime of the model, make sure that the Wasserstein distance, so the topological similarity between those functions, is minimal. So that's already good, because that enforces that, for instance, the shapes that you predict, they actually have the right topology, so they don't have more holes or more connected components than you want them to have, right? But they follow along nicely here. And the second component here shown in blue, which is somehow unexpected maybe, this reduces what I would call the geometrical topological variation of the predicted likelihood function. So notice that this only uses the prediction here. It doesn't use the ground truth function, because we cannot change the ground truth function anyway. So there's no need in calculating this. But this term is kind of like a total variation maybe of a function, but in a topological sense. If you're familiar with total variation distance or total variation minimization of functions, then this is exactly the same thing, but in the topological realm. And it kind of enforces that you get nice smooth volumes that don't have like very jagged surfaces, for instance. And together, we were able to make this fly and work. So we obtained a combined loss by choosing some kind of scaling parameter, lambda, and then we just calculate our geometrical loss plus lambda times the topological loss. The lambda is necessary because they live a little bit on different scales. And so by tweaking lambda, you can essentially also change the influence a certain part of the loss term has. So for instance, if you set lambda to 0, of course, then you just get the geometrical loss. If you set it to extremely high value, then the geometry of the data set is not important anymore, and you just use the topology. Both are extremal values that are not super useful in practice, but somewhere in between, and you can, of course, choose this by cross-validation or hyperparameter search. Somewhere in between, this works out. And let me show you some results here. So without going into the specifics of the different metrics that we calculate, we find that whenever we calculate the topological loss term, our mean and median performance is going down. No, sorry, I should say the error is going down. So we have very, very low errors in all of these metrics here, except for this case here, which is the surface roughness. It's quite near though, and so nothing to worry about, I would say. So in all the relevant metrics for two different data sets, we obtain substantially lower errors. We also checked, this is in the paper, of course, we also checked that these errors are statistically significantly lower. And so this works out really nicely. And the cool thing is that this almost requires no additional computational resources at all, because the model already predicts a volume anyway. And so calculating topological features from a simplified version of that volume is very easily doable, very efficient. And the loss term calculation also doesn't cost us too much. So this is a very nice way. It's a very nicely wrapped gift that we got here from the topological data analysis methods, I would say. Now, this already brings me to the end of this talk, and I'm happy to discuss things with you. So first of all, I think what I wanted to show you here, and I hope that I've succeeded, is that topology can actually provide useful inductive biases for these shape reconstruction tasks, but also for kind of observational tasks like in the fMRI dataset. It turns out that persistence diagrams actually encode geometrical and topological properties of the data. So it's not just one or the other, but it's kind of a combination. But moreover, the last point is my main takeaway message, actually. So despite all of this looking a little bit like weird, potentially, mathematically speaking, the integration into standard machine learning models or modern machine learning models, what pick your poison here, right, is definitely possible. So this is not a thing that lives on its own and that cannot be applied in practice, but it really can throw it on your own data and make this work. There's two publications that I would suggest if you're interested in learning more about this. So one is a survey by Felix, Michael, and myself. It's a survey of topological machine learning methods. So it's specifically geared towards people that want to do deep learning or machine learning with topology-based inflection. So it doesn't really go deep into the theoretical details because it doesn't have to, but it rather just tries to provide a good overview. The other one is this recent manuscript here, so which will soon, as I said, be at MICI. So it's called Capturing Shape Information with Multiscale Topological Loss Terms for 3D Reconstruction. You can already find the previous version in archive. New version is coming tomorrow. This stuff has been calculated with a recent framework that I've been working on, and where, for instance, Nikolai was also kind enough to already contribute some codes. I'm really, really happy about this. This framework is called PyTorch Topological, and of course, it's a shamelessly borrowed name from PyTorch Geometric, with the idea that if people don't have a very deep knowledge about topology, they should still be able to benefit from this in their applications if that ever works. So it's under development. Maybe if you want to use it, or if you have a pilot, then I'm happy to discuss things that we can add there. So as soon as more of my group members actually start getting a contract here in Germany, they will also be available for helping out here, because that's going to be our group's flagship product. And now, thank you for your attention, and also, of course, thanks a lot to my co-authors, and in particular for this presentation here, it's Carsten, Dominic, Felix, and Michael. So thank you very much. Happy to take your questions now.